Good morning, afternoon, or evening, depending on where this finds you, and a warm welcome to this webinar on lessons learned from previous NPT review conferences. This event is part of a series of NPT-related events that have been organised by UNIDIR in collaboration with the United Nations Office for Disarmament Affairs, and we're organising these in the lead up to the 2026 NPT Review Conference. The series aims to understand and enhance understanding of key issues and deepen engagement with the NPT review process as we head towards the review conference next year. I should note from the outset that this event is being recorded, and the recording will be made available through UNIDIR's YouTube channel in due course. And I hope this is useful because I'm aware there are several competing parallel events, as is often the case at the moment with the disarmament calendar. For the purpose of today's event, we'll focus on lessons learned from previous conferences, and we have an esteemed panel to bring different perspectives to this topic. We will hear from our panel shortly, and I'll begin with some kick-off questions from my side before we open the floor out to questions from participants. To ask questions, please use the Q&A function, which can be found at the bottom of your screens, and submit your questions in writing through that route. And I would encourage you, please do share questions and send us questions and comments. It's extremely helpful. Before we turn to our panel, though, I'm delighted to give the screen to Ambassador Do Hong Viet, Permanent Representative of the Socialist Republic of Vietnam to the UN. Ambassador Viet is also the President-designate of the 2026 NPT Review Conference. So we're delighted he's able to join us and provide some opening remarks. And with that, the floor is yours, sir.
Thank you very much, James, and thank you and good afternoon from Vienna, from the headquarters of the IAEA, where I currently am finding myself visiting and conducting my consultations with our colleagues here in Vienna. Let me begin by expressing my sincere appreciation to you, James, and to UNIDIR, to UNODA for convening today's discussion. Of course, you have been long playing a very important role to reflect, to analyze, and to learn from past experiences. And I'm very honored to be alongside with Ambassador President Gustavo Zlauvinen, as well as Chris King, Ms. Gaukar Mukasanova, and other panelists, because your insights are essential for me and for the broader public to understand the past cycles of the review conferences. And in particular, as I take up this responsibility, I do that with much humility and as a learner. And as I discussed with Ambassador Zlauvinen yesterday, it has been a very steep learning curve for me as I prepare for the review conference. I believe that understanding the past is crucial for us to be able to shape the present and the future, because as someone has said it very well, history may not repeat itself, but it often rhymes. And learning from past experience, I believe, is an extremely good way to help all of us to shape the future. The 11th Review Conference takes place in a severely challenging security environment. Geopolitical tensions have deepened. Trust has been eroding. Nuclear rhetoric has been intensifying. And long-standing issues that underpin the implementation of the NPT's core undertakings are more starkly exposed. And these realities really force us to be even more careful in shaping the narrative at the upcoming review conference. This is the reason why I believe that it is even more important that we reflect on past review cycles with intellectual honesty. We need to look back in the immense efforts by states parties, by stakeholders, by past presidents and chairs, and really, build on all that meaningful efforts and experience to be able to in the most effective manner for the review conference itself. And I also believe that it is important that we engage broadly with research institutions like UNIDIR, with civil society, with regional centers and expert community to help all of us understand the political and the technical landscape and understand the lessons that we have learned, lessons about the process, lessons about the substance, about expectations, about communication, and find out where cooperation is possible, even in times of tension that we are finding ourselves in. And the lessons, the positive ones, the not so good ones as well. And I have found my discussions with, especially with Ambassador Zlauvinen, extremely useful in learning from his experience as the president of the 10th Review Conference, especially now with some hindsight. So I again very much appreciate the opportunity to take part in this. If I may suggest or pose a couple of questions as well. I know you, James, have prepared some questions for the panelists, but if I may, from this very beginning, to ask for the panelists' views on some practical lessons, both positive and negative, from the last review cycle, and what challenges may differ from today from those in 2022, and basically what we have learned from that process, and perhaps what we can today still apply in current circumstances. Secondly, I would also like to hear from the panelists on how we can effectively carry forward the knowledge, the documents, the understandings that have accumulated over the many cycles that we have gone through across the pillars, the three pillars of the NPT. And how those lessons may be applied in the upcoming review conference. And thirdly, how we can preserve and transmit institutional memory. We have some really good institutional memory in individuals like Chris King, who have been in the Secretariat for many years, as well as in the academic institutions. But how can we also share that with states parties and the broader public, so that the review process itself can become more accessible and better understood and more inclusive for the broader public. So with that, again, I thank you, James, and thanks the organizers for allowing me to take part in this. I will need to get into my car to go to Cyberdorf for the afternoon visit, but I will be, following the discussion, and I think I have the opportunity to also see the recordings later on as well. So again, thank you very much, and I look forward to hearing valuable insights. Thank you very much.
Many thanks, Ambassador, for your encouraging words, your insights, and setting the scene, and safe onward travels. I should also thank you for your questions. They're certainly most welcome by me as a moderator, and I think there was 3 there for our panelists to consider. I also take note of your all for looking back historically and reflecting with intellectual honesty, which I think is a great segue into our panel, and perhaps turning the floor to Ambassador Gustavo Zlauvinen. Ambassador Zlauvinen is the permanent representative of Argentina to the United Nations in Vienna. He previously served as the president of the 10th NPT Review Conference and has extensive experience in the field of disarmament dating back to the late 1980s, where he joined the Department for Nuclear and Disarmament Affairs of the Argentine Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Ambassador Zlauvinen, thank you so much for joining us. And I'm hoping following Ambassador Viet's remarks, you could provide some reflections and lessons from your experience in 2022. And the screen is yours, sir.
Thank you, Jamie, and thank you to UNIDIR for organizing this event. Very useful and very timely. I'm very pleased to see and hear Ambassador Viet, the president-designate of the 11th Review Conference. It's an honor to be with him sharing this event, as well as Chris King and Baukart. I'm going to be brief in the sense that I share fully what Ambassador Viet has pointed out, in the sense that each review conference is different from the previous, but also have many elements in common. The differences, one can identify them as the change in international environment, which makes at least some member states change their views, even positions, with regarding to all issues. So not the same member state will have the same position on one issue that have been repeated throughout the review conferences. So you have a change of position with regard to all issues, but then you will have the emergence of new issues for which you will have new positions, evolving positions. So it's a double challenge that each review conference will face, and in particular the president-designate, on how to maneuver between these moving, just a chessboard. And I believe that one should focus as a baseline, what are the elements that we have been dealing with throughout, just the time line of the review conferences. And obviously, there are the three pillars, in particular, nuclear disarmament. Obviously, just is a very strong sentiment by the great majority of member states, and these have been reflected in the 10th review conference about, the lack of progress on nuclear disarmament. Is something that is going to be again expressed at the 11th. I think we have to take into account that is going to be replicated. The question is going to be a change from, in particular, some of the N5, how they're going to have to react to that. And obviously, as Ambassador Viet mentioned, the linkage with, commitments adopted in previous review conferences. The same goes for the non-proliferation pillar. Obviously, the evolution of those issues is a challenge, and therefore you have to measure and gauge what will be the position at the 11th Review Conference of the main relevant actors related to that regional issue. Then I will go, just in particular, the Middle East nuclear weapons-free zone. This is a subject of that, but it has an entity in itself. And we have seen that, at least in the 10th review conference, we managed, at least, relevant delegations managed to get around a minimum text of consensus. There was part of the draft document that was not adopted, but in itself, that part of the text was kind of, not in agreement, but it could have been adopted. So I think just we can pick up on that and other elements of that draft document. But also, I would say that we have a new challenge also. Traditionally, the third pillar on the peaceful uses of nuclear energy have been a non-contentious issue, and have been evolving as just the world and many developing countries are moving more and more into considering just nuclear applications, and there is a larger demand for example, nuclear power stations in Asia, Latin America, etc. We were always, in at least, countries like Argentina, from developing countries' perspective, that it was, had to be expanded. Always we felt that, the third pillar was not equally balanced vis-a-vis, the first and the second one. But at the 10th review conference, we managed to put almost an equal stand. I think that is something that, just President-designate Ambassador Viet will have it as a basis. I think he can and will, I'm sure he will build up on that. But also take into account a new element, which what happened at the IAEA General Conference just a month ago, about in September, when, for the first time, the report or the resolution on peaceful applications was not adopted because of connection to, just the Pact for the Future or gender issues. So I believe that is going to, unfortunately, permeate into the negotiations of the 11th. So there you have something that it came from the past, that we have a good basis from the 10th, NPT Review Conference, but we'll have facing a new challenge. But I think just, aside of the substantive issue that I just mentioned, just to name a few, therefore we have to look into how the dynamics of the negotiations up to the previous review conferences took place. And I believe that we can improve our dynamics and negotiations at the review conference based on the past experience. And I think probably in the 10th review conference, thanks to Chris and his predecessor, Johan Tudor, we improved, just those processes. But I think still is a lot of margin for maneuver to keep improving, and we have this conversation with the president-designate. But I think just, the member states have to engage over there. And one particular suggestion we have been discussing with the president-designate is for a need for more real negotiations at the review conference, not in separate groups, not in separate, instances, but, just at the actual main committees, and not for the delegation to go and state what they already stated at the beginning of the conference, but repeating themselves in each of the pillars, which is not conducive to actual negotiations. I think we have to move into really the second and the third week, push delegation to start actual negotiations on a language, on a text, or at least what are the common goals on the different issues. Yes, and that implies moving into the negotiations and maybe start working with a zero draft by the president, a much earlier stage that we have done in all previous review conferences. And to do that, I think just as a community, all members of the NPT, we have just to go to the review conference with having in our mind, setting what would be our common overall goal. I think we don't have that clarity. I think we tried to push it in the 10th, but we didn't manage. I think probably we can base on our experience and push member states to go to the review conference already with an idea of what we want as a community. Aside of the particular national interests and positions, obviously, that each delegation will have, but also identify the areas of agreement cooperations, in particular, in the what I call, and then just systemic issues, and encapsulate the controversial issues that always arise in each review conference, because those, I define them that they are not of a systemic nature. I think we have to differentiate between issues that they are systemic, and therefore we have to just deal with that as a community, and then non-systemic issues, therefore they have to be encapsulated because of the political context in which they take place. I would stop now here. I could continue a bit longer, but I know that other members of the panel may want to share their views also. Thank you.
Many thanks, Ambassador Zlauvinen. That's really helpful from our side, so thank you very much. I think in setting out some of the challenges and continuity and changes across pillars, I think that's extremely useful, and pointing to some areas of previous work we can pick up again, perhaps, and other areas we need to update. I also take note of your points on negotiations or beginning negotiations earlier and the separation between systemic and non-systemic issues. I think your point on the dynamics of negotiation also leads neatly to our next speaker. So I would now like to introduce Chris King. Chris is the Chief of the Weapons of Mass Destruction Branch at the United Nations Office for Disarmament Affairs. He has worked extensively on a range of WMD issues and has long-standing experience with NPT-related matters. Indeed, I think these date back to at least 2010, but I'm sure Chris will correct me. Chris, thank you for joining us. I realise we may have interrupted your morning schedule, so it's very much appreciated. And perhaps you could provide an overview of the process and some of the modalities for a review conference. So what should participants expect, as well as taking any of the questions that were raised earlier? And the floor is yours, sir.
Thank you, Jamie, and thanks to UNIDIR for organising this event. I do think it's really useful for delegates to have a good understanding of how the process and the procedure is going to work, and to get some insights from people who have been there and done that. So, thank you again. It's great to be here, obviously, with the President Designate. I have been astounded at the alacrity with which he has embraced his role as President Designate, and how open he has been to ideas, and how much he is listening, and how much he is absorbing. And of course, there's no better training for me for the 2026 Review Conference than having been in the trenches with Ambassador Zlauvinen in 2022. And finally, it's great to be on a panel, always to be on a panel with Goha, because nobody knows more about the NPT review process and its history than Goha. So to start off with a very procedural analysis, because I think that there are, a lot of people obviously who have not participated in review conferences, and as Ambassador Zlauvinen said, they're all a bit different, but they're also all the same. So, and they have kind of congealed into the current way that we go about them over the course, really, since the existence of the treaty, since the first review conference in 75, through to some changes that were made in 85 regarding main committee structures, through to 1995 and the indefinite extension of the treaty, and the current sort of process that we have today. And that process, really, since 2010 at least, has been along the lines of we will start with a plenary session in which we adopt a variety of procedural matters. Those include the election of the president, obviously. It includes adoption of things like who's going to chair the main committees, because even though the preparatory committee has decided on all of these, the review conference does need to give its seal of approval as the decision-making body in the review cycle. We need to adopt rules of procedure. We need to decide whether there will be subsidiary bodies, and if there are going to be subsidiary bodies, what are those going to be? We need to adopt a program of work. So there's a variety of just standard procedural stuff that needs to be done. And then obviously we move into general debate. And that general debate usually lasts about a week. I can say now that we have at least informal approval that the general debate will take place in the General Assembly Hall, as it has previously taken place for prior review conferences. And then, of course, we move into the main committee structures. Main Committee 1 deals with, and the items that the main committees will deal with was approved by the PrepCom. So Main Committee 1 will obviously deal with Article 6 and Pillar 1, the disarmament measures. Main Committee 2 deals with Articles 1, 2, and 3, obviously, and the non-proliferation elements, and some of the regional elements as well. And then Main Committee 3 deals with Article 4 and other elements of the treaty. So Pillar 3, which is peaceful uses. But Main Committee 3 has also historically dealt with issues such as the strengthened review process, and of course Article 10, which is withdrawal from the treaty. On the issue of subsidiary bodies, the 1995 Review Conference was clear that subsidiary bodies should be established to deal with specific items that require further elaboration. Now, that has not necessarily worked in practice. I think member states, because of the keen emphasis they have put on balance across all three pillars of the treaty, have always been pretty keen that if there is a subsidiary body on one element of the treaty, there should be a subsidiary body on all three elements of the treaty. So we have ended up with a structure, at least since 2010, where you have subsidiary bodies for disarmament, subsidiary bodies for regional issues, non-proliferation regional issues, which is primarily focused on the 1995 resolution on the Middle East zone free of nuclear weapons and other WMD. And then, of course, you have a third subsidiary body on peaceful uses and other elements of the treaty. That has just kind of been standard practice over the course now of the last 15 years. So we go from the main committees, and then main committees will meet in parallel. We'll have subsidiary bodies that also meet as part of that for 2 weeks. We go main committee, subsidiary body, main committee, subsidiary body. And then in the final week, we are supposed to have the plenary. And the plenary will supposedly wrap things up and give us our review of the treaty and the final outcome document that we are looking at. Aside from the fact that we know we're supposed to have main committees, and we know we can have subsidiary bodies, and we know that thanks to the 1995 resolution, we are supposed to look both backward and forward. There is surprisingly little guidance as to how we get to the outcome. And I know Goha is going to talk about this, so I will leave that up to her, what the outcomes actually look like. But the long and the short of it is that we have 4 weeks to try and get from a very large general debate through quite intense main committee and subsidiary body structures and somehow come out on the other end with an outcome document. A lot of that will depend on the president. A lot of that will depend on the main committee chairs who will form his bureau, but a lot of that depends on states parties as well and their willingness to just crack on and keep going with the treaty. Now, of course, as I said, there's very little guidance about how we get there, and some of the guidance is not actually utilized. So, for example, states parties might be aware that we do have a general committee of 34 vice presidents, the presidents, the main committee chairs, the drafting committee chair, and the credentials committee chair. And that committee is supposed to reconcile overlaps and differences between the reports of the main committee chairs when we're coming up with a review of the treaty. Unfortunately, that main committee, because it is so large, has never really met. So what we've ended up with instead, at least again since 2010, is small group negotiations that often happen outside of the review conference itself. Now, there is no provision for those. They are usually undertaken by friends of the president. For example, in 2022, Ambassador Zlauvinen, seeing that it was very difficult to get to consensus, asked Jarmo Vyönen of Finland to undertake small group consultations on Pillar 1. And that was how we ended up with a draft outcome document for that. But again, I guess the point that I'm trying to make, Jamie, and I will wrap up now, the point that I'm trying to make is that there's a lot that is written down that doesn't get used, and there's a lot that's not written down that does, but the basic structure is the same. General debate, main committees, subsidiary bodies, and then trying to get an outcome in the last week.
Thank you, Chris. I think it's a really helpful overview of what to expect, and I wasn't rushing you. I hope you don't think I was. If you do have questions or comments for Chris or for Ambassador Zlauvinen, please do submit these in the Q&A function. I think we have one of those. But before we do get to the questions, I'm delighted to welcome Gauka Mukatsanova. Gauka holds the Japan Chair for a World Without Nuclear Weapons and is based in the Vienna Center for Disarmament and Non-Proliferation, VCDNP. And as previous panelists have pointed out, Gauka is a doyen of all things NPT related and has long-standing experience, also dating back to 2010, I believe. Gauka, thank you so much for joining us, especially as I know you're slightly under the weather. But if I could ask you to provide a bit of an overview of past outcomes in relation to NPT review conferences, and I suppose what could emerge from the review conference at this time round. And the screen is yours, Gauka. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jamie, for the kind introduction, and thank you to UNIDIR for having me on this webinar, and in a great company of very good, illustrious speakers who have covered quite a lot of ground already of what so making my job quite a bit easier. And by way of a disclaimer or an excuse, Jamie already mentioned I'm under the weather. I have COVID. So if I start to sound a bit delirious, I would blame it on that rather than the effects of experiencing the NPT review cycle a couple of times in the past decade or so. So the assignment is to sort of jog through the history of the NPT review process and what outcomes have emerged from past review conferences. And as a good NPT review process follower, I'm going to start with the mandate, which is derived from Article 8 of the Non-Proliferation Treaty itself, and that is to review the operation of the NPT with a view to assuring that the purposes of the treaty provisions and preamble are being realized. So not a very elaborate assignment, and as Chris mentioned, with absolutely no guidance as to how to go about it. And then pursuant to the Decision 1 of the 1995 Review and Extension Conference, and with further clarifications adopted in 2000, the mandate had been clarified a bit and expanded to not only focus on the review of past operation, but also set a forward-looking agenda, right? And that has been sort of the operation of of the review process since 1995. But once again, very little guidance in terms of formal rules, written instructions about how to go about the review and what review conference should produce, what should really be the outcome of the process, which is not surprising, right? The treaties tend to be not particularly instructive about these details. And the NPT review process in general is known to operate largely by established practice rather than written rule. And therefore, the idea that the most desirable outcome is a consensus final document has been established through precedent since the very first NPT Review Conference that convened in 1975. Once again, it is not surprising that that is the general preference. It's a fairly easy binary metric of success. Do we have an agreed document? Yes, no. And by that measure, we have had a rather spotted record in the NPT review process. We've had 10 review conferences so far. 4 of them adopted final documents. One in 95 adopted a package of decisions. And that leaves 5 conferences without any agreed documents coming out. And now we're facing for the first time a situation where 2 review conferences in a row adopted nothing, and except for one decision on a working group. And there's a lot of concern, as was mentioned already, that we're looking at with the potentially 3rd review conference in a row without an agreed final document, or at least the kind of final document that we imagine usually to be the successful outcome. But what are we talking about in terms of these final documents? Have they been uniform? Absolutely not. There's been quite a bit of variety, and really looking beyond the binary of yes, no, do we have a final document in terms of the measure of success? What we see is not only different kind of formats and shapes of documents, but also different ways that the states parties themselves couch the success or purported success of the review conference. For example, and the way those documents were actually prepared and negotiated and adopted. The first review conference in 1975 ended with the adoption of a fairly brief final declaration, and that was primarily drafted by the president. It wasn't a thoroughly negotiated document. It was something that the president gave to the states parties at the end of the day, and they, for the sake of the treaty and unity, agreed to adopt it by consensus. But only on the condition that a whole range of interpretive statements, basically containing caveats and kind of disclaimers and state interpretations of this final declaration, be attached to it as part of the kind of final report. So it wasn't necessarily at the time viewed as a clear-cut success, even though there was a consensus final document, because of all the caveats kind of attached to it. That said, history tends to forget such details. When we look back, we just say such and such conference had a final outcome without necessarily going into detail of how it came about and how the states themselves at the time interpreted the degree of success. Another thing to point out in terms of a review of the outcomes is that earlier in the RevCons, states parties held broader views on what could come out of the review conference. Again, we had the precedent from the 75 of the final declaration, but all through the 80s and until at least the 1990 review conference, states parties, groups of states parties also every time submitted draft resolutions, draft decisions for the review conference to adopt, even draft protocols for the treaty. So it wasn't set in stone by any means that the one outcome should be a comprehensive final document, which is why I think in 1995, at least in part, the idea that the RevCon would adopt a set of different decisions and resolutions wasn't seen as revolutionary as it might look today going into the review conference. However, with more RevCons, with more kind of precedent being set, we got a more solidified, if not calcified, expectation of a comprehensive final document adopted by consensus. 1995 is a special case in the history of the review process. It was by far the most important review conference. It had a legal treaty-based mandate to adopt a decision on the extension of the treaty. And this is an example of a successful conference that achieved its main goal without a final document reviewing the operation of the treaty. Primarily, of course, because all the work and effort was concentrated on getting the decision on indefinite extension, but work on the review continued throughout the conference. It wasn't in the end possible to adopt a review part. But the package of decisions comprising the indefinite extension, the strengthening the review of the treaty, and principles and objectives is widely hailed as the biggest, perhaps the biggest success in the history of the review process. And I think what brought about that success was the necessity, or combination of necessity. Once again, you had the mandate emanating from the treaty. It was the one conference that absolutely had to end with some kind of a decision. And determination of key actors, including the United States, to get an outcome, plus the creativity and the skill of the president himself that were the drivers of success and produced this package of decisions. The post-1995 review process and its outcomes are what is mostly in focus when we talk about the review process. In 1995, what was at the core of the debates surrounding not only the indefinite extension, but also other decisions was the accountability, increasing accountability of the review process and coming up with goals and yardsticks for better assessing implementation of the treaty, especially Article 6 on nuclear disarmament, and that's at the core of the strengthened review process and principles and objectives. Therefore, after 1995, there was growing focus on this kind of forward-looking part, agenda setting in the review conferences and their outcomes. So we had two conferences that produced agreed outcomes after 95, in 2000 and in 2010. 2000 is the only truly comprehensive outcome document fully negotiated by states parties in the history of the review process. And the 2010 produced a consensus action plan, again, focused on the forward-looking agenda, whereas the review was not agreed by consensus. So it is understandable that there was an increasing focus on the forward-looking agenda setting, trying again to fulfill this mandate of increased accountability and benchmarks. But if we are ending up increasingly with a set of action items and agendas that don't have then a follow-through, don't have implementation, I think we're going to see the focus shifting once again back to the review part, which might produce further sort of problems in trying to agree on a consensus document. And if we really focus on looking at agreed review of operation implementation, we've only had it 3 times in the whole history of the NPT, right? In 75, 85, and 2000. And that raises the question of whether it is a feature rather than a bug of the review process of the treaty and direct consequence of the system itself, right? With 5 nuclear weapon states, is it really realistic? Is it possible to agree by consensus on a text that's highly critical of the lack of Article 6 implementation? And until we have much better record of Article 6 implementation, now we're really looking at the possibility of never agreeing on a very honest review. On the issue of compliance with non-proliferation and safeguards obligations, again, naming any state in particular in connection with these issues proves impossible in practice when decisions have to be made by consensus. So this is kind of the enduring challenge for future review conferences and possibly raising the need for states parties to rethink how they go about assessing implementation of the treaty and how they go about agreeing on such an assessment. Now, there's another way to look at outcomes, perhaps, and that's to question what is the outcome in the sense of what emerged as a conclusion or as a crystallized picture about the state of the treaty and the regime, where the priorities are, where do state parties stand vis-a-vis nuclear weapons and nuclear order, the picture that could emerge from a review conference. And here we can also certainly have an outcome from any review conference, whether or not it has adopted a final document or not. And for example, let's take a conference that didn't have an agreed final document, the 1990 RevCon. You can say that its main outcome was the crystallization of the point that there won't be another agreed document without progress on the comprehensive test ban. That idea had been building through previous review conferences, and I think it really reached that breaking point in 1990 when it crystallized that to achieve anything beyond, you'll need to have progress on the test ban, and that came into play at the next review conference in 1995. Similarly, the last review conference, the 2015 review conference didn't have a final agreed outcome, but I think it didn't have the agreed document. But one of its outcomes was the realization that the reshaping of the discourse on the legitimacy of nuclear weapons and nuclear deterrence has taken place. It crystallized the reality that the discourse had shifted and a majority had formed among states parties in favor of pursuing a legal prohibition. Again, it's not a final document, but it's one of kind of the main takeaways from a review conference. Looking at 2022, I think one way to look at the outcome is the realization of the transformation of the role of some of the key actors in the NPT, the treaty and the review process, Russia in particular, and the transformation of dynamics within the nuclear weapon states. And I think we will probably see more of that in 2026 with the changing role and priorities of the key actors, including the United States. And so even if we don't have a final document, I think there'll be further crystallization of this kind of new dynamics in the NPT community. But going back to the possibility of there being some kind of an agreed document, I'd like to again think back to 1995 and this combination of the necessity and creativity and determination. So that's my question for 2026. Do we have that combination of a sense of urgency, the determination among states parties that they absolutely have to come up with something, they have to agree on something in 2026 for the sake of the treaty, and do we have the kind of commensurate creativity and skill of the diplomats, starting with the president designate, to use that sense of urgency and to arrive at some kind of compromise that may not take the form of a comprehensive document, but maybe something else, some kind of resolution, a set of decisions, etc. And one possibility is pushing forward and kind of recommitment to the first principles agreement on the need to prevent any use of nuclear weapons and recommitment to exert every effort to prevent the use of nuclear weapons and achieve their complete elimination. It seems very basic. It's not a very high bar, but perhaps this is what the moment demands, and this is where the landing zone could be for states parties. I'll stop there. I'll talk probably a little too much, but happy to engage in further discussion. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Gauka, for joining us despite having COVID. I think it's a testament to your commitment on this particular topic. And I really appreciate sort of overview of historical outcomes and perhaps laying a challenge almost to combine creation of a sense of urgency with commensurate creativity and skill. But thank you very much. Having concluded the first round of remarks, I'm going to turn to some of the questions that we have. It's good to see we have a couple in the Q&A function already. I do welcome others, so please do write those in the Q&A function, so I'll get to as many as possible. But perhaps I can turn first to you, Ambassador Zlauvinen, with a question which has been put in the chat directed towards you. And it said the implementation side of Article 4 is the IAEA, and the NPT Review Conference cannot direct the IAEA what to do, much less so it can direct nuclear vendors. NPT states also cannot allocate the financial resources. I think there's a question in there, related to kind of linked with what do countries really want from the third pillar, I think is the core question there, and the context bit is the other bits that I went around. Then I've got another couple of questions, but perhaps I can turn to you first, Ambassador. Sure,
Jamie, thank you. I will do a counter question to the anonymous participant. If that is true, then the NPT Review Conference shouldn't be addressing the issues of safeguards, because at the end of the day, safeguards are implemented by the IAEA. I mean, technically, the NPT doesn't implement anything. So because Article 6 have to be implemented by the nuclear weapon state themselves, non-proliferation to be verified, implemented by member states and verified by the IAEA. And the same goes for the peaceful applications, in the sense that it's up to member state to implement or not. And then we ask, not even ask, the agency has the role and mandate to do it. So we were talking about here is that the political role by the NPT and the member states to address these issues, whether the obligations but also the benefits impinging from the NPT are still valid, and therefore the question about just nuclear applications is still valid. I think that to have a political platform at the NPT Review Conference to discuss about peaceful applications and relevance that it's has for many countries in their own development is very valid, and has to be restated at the political level, because it's not only for experts, and that's just the differentiation between when the IAEA discuss in the TC, technical cooperations about just peaceful applications, is among experts. I'm based in Vienna. I'm the PR of Argentina to the IAEA, and every time we discuss about peaceful applications, is among us, among experts. But now when we discuss peaceful applications at the NPT Review Conference, is beyond experts. It's many delegations come from capitals, as I did it just in my own in the past, and therefore you have a wider range of government officials dealing with these issues, and therefore you can reach out to other elements of the governments not dealing with nuclear issues, but then just to be aware that the nuclear issues are relevant. So I think that member states ask and wants to have discussions on peaceful applications at the NPT Review Conference, and it's a valid question. So my answer is, again, as a new question. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador. I have a second question, in fact, two questions, which I'll try and combine. And I think Gaukar has already covered some of this, but perhaps I can put it to you, Chris, as well, if you want to respond. But what do you think of the possibility of adopting separate outcomes on different topics in the form of individual resolutions, as Gaukar touched upon as was done in 1995 with the Middle East resolution? And then if I can combine this with another question we have, do you still think it's better to adopt a final document, even if the content is watered down to the lowest common denominator and represents a step backwards? Chris, if you want to take either of those, then the screen is yours. Thank you.
Thanks, Jamie. I mean, if I could, I might just also add to what Ambassador Zlauvinen said about Article 4 too, which is to simply say that Article 4 in the NPT reflects a principle, and it reflects a principle about a right to the peaceful uses of nuclear energy, and it reflects a principle about the need to facilitate the peaceful uses of nuclear energy. So I think the role of the NPT there is that as is the case with safeguards, the IAEA is the body that carries out the day-to-day. It's the same with peaceful uses, and therefore the NPT has exactly the same role, which is to make sure that that principle is being enacted, and it's to make sure that that facilitation is taking place. And it's to one, I think, support the IAEA, reinforce the IAEA's role, and see what it can do to enhance and bolster the IAEA's role in terms of the delivery of peaceful uses. But there are also, I think, other things that the NPT can be doing. For example, looking at regional approaches to the peaceful uses of nuclear energy. What can states be doing there in cooperation again with the IAEA? On the question of separate decisions, there's a couple of things. As Goha would be the first to tell you, that 1995 Review and Extension Conference was mandated to look at to take decisions, especially obviously on the indefinite extension. But having said that, and I have said this ad nauseum, and I know that the High Representative for Disarmament Affairs has said this ad nauseum as well, there is no template for what an outcome looks like. As Goha has really highlighted, 95, 2000, and 2010 all looked very, very different. And I think that that's something that states parties need to keep in mind, is that, they should come up with an outcome that is appropriate and reflective for this review conference. It may not be 64 actions. It might be something much shorter and sharper. Goha referred to the original outcome from 1975. I mean, that's a 6-page document that somehow manages to do the entire review of the treaty. So I think there's a lot of things that you can look at when looking at. One thing I would be careful about separate decisions, though, is that states parties, because the review conference is the only forum in which states parties actually negotiate anything, there is a lot of, and again, Ambassador Zlauvinen knows this better than most, there is a lot of what's called hostage taking, which is that because there is such a focus on what people's key issues are, if you try to have separate decisions, there will be a lot of people try to say, well, you can't have your decision if I don't get mine. Therefore, both the decisions have to be taken at the same time. That does mean, though, you can separate out core issues into very distinct parts, but be wary that a package approach depends on everyone still getting their way, and a consensus approach still depends on everyone getting their way, or at least agreeing that no one gets their way. And so yes, I agree that we should be looking at each and every single format we can, but be wary that at the end of the day, it's still likely to come down to consensus. On the issue of whether an outcome document is needed or not, I mean, ultimately, as with all things related to this treaty, it's about what states parties want. It's about whether states parties feel at the end of the day, not having an outcome is satisfactory to them. They feel that what happened during the course of the review conference, the reviews through the general debate, the main committees, the subsidiary bodies, the willingness to look forward, the concrete discussion, if they think that was enough and they're satisfied with that, then that's fine too. But it seems to me that states parties feel like they need a piece of paper at the end of a review conference. As Goha said, that's often not the review. But what that looks like, whether that's just something that reaffirms that their commitment to the treaty and the obligations that they've undertaken, including at review conferences, that's something to think about as well. What I will say about, I think, the focus on why states want an outcome as badly as they do is a lot related to Pillar 1, increasingly Pillar 3, but mostly related to Pillar 1 and disarmament. And I think it's because there is a general sense amongst non-nuclear weapon states that Pillar 1 has slowed to a halt, and that there is no accountability for the implementation of commitments that have been given in 95, 2000, and 2010. And as a result, an outcome which recommits the nuclear weapon states in particular to their obligations under the treaty is a form of accountability. Now, there's a lot of dialogue and really, really good dialogue about reporting at the moment and what that means for accountability and how you can strengthen accountability. I think that's something that needs to be considered in the context of an outcome and what this review conference can actually produce. Thanks.
Thank you, Chris. I think that's really helpful. I welcome further questions, but also I wanted to turn to Gaukar. I mean, you sort of covered this already, but if you wanted to respond to those questions directly, equally, Ambassador Zlauvinen, did you want to respond to those? Please, perhaps if I can start with you, Ambassador, then turn to you, Gaukar, if that's okay. Ambassador, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you, Jamie. Thank you. No, exactly. Following up on what Chris have said, that if we go back to the overall issue of outcome, and I thank Gaukar for an amazing presentation on the history of the different review conferences' outcomes, or the lack of in some cases, that I see more and more that just both member states, but also civil society, are pushing for a consensus outcome document, yes, or whether we should split it into 2 or 3 different documents, or we have one, whether we should have a short one or a long one. But no one is asking, the real question is, what for? I mean, why we want an outcome document, short or long, unified or split it, and no one is giving me that answer. I think just, we are just moving ahead with only just to have an outcome document for the sake of having an outcome document, maybe only just to call a review conference successful or not. But my question is, say that by sheer lack, we managed to get a final outcome document by consensus, and then if the obligations are not fully respected by some member states, I mean, what is the value of the document? So I think we have to go back to square one. I think we have moved so much of ourselves into having a document, or we have failed, but we can have a document like, the 2010, and then it was not implemented. I think we have to go back into why we need a document, what was the benefit of having a document. And I think that is linked to what Gaukar was saying, the lack of yardsticks, the lack of time lamps for the implementation of obligations. I think that is more relevant than having a document or not. I think we have to do some, revisiting our positions. I think we are getting to just having a document, push for documents, and not asking ourselves, what we want out of that process.
Many thanks, Ambassador. Gaukar, you've been quite patient. There was 2 questions on outcomes that were raised. There's also a third question, which I've seen, and I'll read it out. Can we say the 2020 review conference did have an outcome in the form of the creation of the working group on strengthening the review process? If yes, what can this teach us? So I don't know whether you wanted to respond to any of the previous points or the last 3 questions. The screen is yours.
Thank you, Jamie. Very, very interesting questions, difficult, some of them. And I would agree with what was said about the key is what is it that states parties believe they're getting out of the final document, and that defines whether it is worth it for them. It could be a weak document. I think twice now in the previous conferences we had a document that many saw as a weak document, and yet the overwhelming majority of states were prepared to go along with it because there was something kind of, the stakes were beyond that, beyond getting everything you want in a document, and more about demonstrating the continued commitment to the treaty. So in that sense, if states parties have that shared feeling, that shared understanding that they're better off with a final document, even if it is seen as a weak one, then I suppose it is worth it for keeping the regime together. On the other hand, they could judge that it is not worth it, that they're sacrificing too much by agreeing to something. And that, again, that was the case in 1990. It was a very principled position of the Mexican delegation that they will not accept a final document without progressive language on the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty. Was it worth it? I think it absolutely was worth it. I think it did help to crystallize that position that you need to get progress. And so I think, again, each conference is a kind of a thing unto itself, a product of circumstances, interests and personalities, and it might be the case in the next review conference that states would rather have an agreement on something than not have an agreement, and that could be a good for the regime writ large, even if not advancing particular progressive points. I won't be like sort of preaching one way or another in this regard. Was the decision on the working group a form of an outcome? Well, yes. I mean, in a sense, yes, it was adopted by states parties, and that was an outcome. What did it tell us? What does it tell us about the review process and that RevCon in particular? I think it demonstrated that 25 years after the indefinite extension, states parties had finally arrived at a point when they were prepared to have another look at the review process. Since the decision on strengthening the review process, they were finally prepared to have a structured, formal discussion about how to improve it. I think that was a positive thing. Unfortunately, we haven't seen consensus outcomes from that yet. But as Chris said, the emergence of the in development of the transparency, accountability, and reporting debate came in large part from that exercise, and it could be the one outcome we could realistically aim for at the next review conference.
Many thanks, Gaukar. Chris, if you wanted to follow up on any of those points, I also have a question, perhaps a slightly different track for you. And you've touched upon this already a little bit, but there's been much discussion around steps to strengthen the review process. And I wonder whether you could provide a bit of an overview of this discussion and where you think this might go in terms of thinking about the next review cycle. And the floor is yours, Chris.
Thanks, Jamie. I mean, yeah, I think a through line throughout this entire review cycle has been this issue of the strengthened review process, and particularly as it's tied to enhanced reporting, which could enable greater accountability for the implementation of existing commitments, given in particular 95, 2000, and in particular 2010. I mean, To the question though about whether or not that working group constituted, the establishment of a working group constituted an outcome, the question again is, do states parties think it constituted an outcome? And my feeling is that they do not. So I think that I also don't know, and I think Ambassador Zlauvinen can correct me here. I don't think the state that broke consensus on the big document was actually in the room for the adoption of the. Certainly, they have intimated subsequently that they may not have supported it, but that's by the by. On the issue of the strength and review process, we had a really, really good working group meeting in Vienna in 2023, like a really, really good. It was interactive, it was engaged. There was a lot of very, very common ground on this notion that we have a 30-year-old review process that may or may not be doing what it's supposed to be doing, but definitely could be made more efficient, effective, transparent, inclusive, etc. There were a lot of really kind of technical means talked about to do that, things about strict speakers time, instituting a bureau, trying to get rid of the overlap between the main committees and the subsidiary bodies, really, really practical ideas that I think everyone was on the same page on. Where there was, however, divergence was obviously on the issue of enhanced reporting for transparency and accountability for the implementation of existing commitments. And I think that's one of the things that we need to be very clear about here is that when we talk about transparency and accountability in that context, it's very much for the implementation of existing commitments, because that is where the frustration from a lot of non-nuclear weapon states have come from. That discussion permeated its way through the other PrepComs as well, but then in particular at the third PrepCom this year, it was very, very prominent. There was an informal session that was held during the lunch break. During the lunch break on the final day of the PrepCom that talked about trying to get a decision on reporting, which I thought was really, really, really useful. Obviously, it didn't achieve what we wanted to achieve, but I thought it was nonetheless very useful. I think on those issues, on those minor procedural tweaks where I think there is a good deal of consensus, I suspect that the president is listening right now as to whether things like strict speaking times, again, overlaps between bodies, those kind of things. I think he's listening to those right now, and he may choose, because it's his prerogative to do so, to institute some of those measures coming into the review conference. On the bigger issue of reporting, or what I am now calling enhanced interactive reporting, I think that issue, there's still a lot of ground that needs to be covered. I do think that there is a lot of widespread support for in-person interactive reporting, where I think that there are serious divergences over what is to be reported on and who should be reporting. Those seem to be the key issues here. Obviously, is it just the nuclear weapon states? Is it non-nuclear weapon states? Is it just on disarmament? Is it across all three pillars of the treaty? And if it's across all three pillars of the treaty, what are we using as our baseline? For example, non-nuclear weapon states have been very vocal that they already report to the IAEA on their safeguards, so they're not going to do anything greater than that. Whereas nuclear weapon states have said that under, the 2010 outcome, the reporting is across the board. So to my mind, those are the steps. What states parties really, really need to consider between now and the review conference is how they want to tackle this issue at the review conference. Does it need a standalone subsidiary body? That's a key question, I think, that states parties need to answer. I've heard people say that, well, could we have 4 subsidiary bodies? Practically, that would be very difficult. Not impossible, but it would be very difficult. Or will this just be the Pillar 3, the main Committee 3 subsidiary body? So these are some of the questions that I think need to be asked. I really think there's a lot of potential here to get a good outcome that really strengthens the implementation of the treaty. But as I said, there's quite a few divergences that need to be bridged between now and then.
Many thanks, Chris. That's really useful for thought there. I noticed, Ambassador Zlauvinen, you're unmuted. Did you want to follow up and respond to Chris's point? In which case, the screen is yours.
Thank you, Jamie. I just to stress that even though in 2022, member state, or at least one member state, was not ready to adopt the draft document, outcome document by consensus. We did manage to get that decision adopted by consensus to establish that working group on strengthening the review process. You can see it as a, as the glass, just full empty or full, just or half empty or half full. I tend to see it as a positive, maybe a small step, but it was positive in the sense that under those circumstances, to get at least a decision adopted by consensus, and an issue that in previous review conferences, some delegations tried to push for that, and they never mastered the consensus. I think it was a small achievement. I think we can use that as an example, maybe for the 2026 review conference, in the sense that let's go for an outcome document in compressed, just very comprehensive one. I fully agree with that. Chris should not and doesn't need to be a long document. But if we fail from doing that, maybe just look into some concrete actions that can be adopted by consensus. Now, the problem about having different, what people call Plan A or Plan B, Plan A being go for an overall full-fledged outcome document or go for a short one, is that you cannot, as a president, you cannot go for both at the same time. It happened to me even before the review conference in 2022. There were some quarters, asking me to start already from scratch, from day one, to start, just negotiating a shorter, more political focused document. And I refused to do so, because if I were to do that, then I couldn't do in parallel, push delegation to start negotiating for a full-fledged document. Because then they will say, well, if your president already working on Plan B, why you're pushing out for Plan A? So basically, you start already with Plan B. And if Plan B fails, then you don't have Plan C, yes? So I decided to go for Plan A, knowing that it was a slim chances of getting a consensus. But when we would, and always I have said, I was going to wait until probably Wednesday, the last Wednesday of the last week, seeing that if, just was going to be impossible to get that full-fledged document by consensus, then I will have 2 days to at least to go for a shorter version. But what happened that Wednesday and even that Thursday, all the indicators I have received from key delegations were that it was very highly possible to get document of consensus. And that, it didn't happen on Friday by 1 p.m. So then it was too late just to move into a shorter version, yes. So I'm not saying that the president-designate may go and start, just going for both tracks at the same time, Plan A and Plan B, but I think it's going to dilute, Plan A at all, So it's up to the president-designate to see that, but it's impossible to predict beforehand until you reach the last week of the review conference.
Many thanks, Ambassador Zlauvinen. I think the president-designate is still on the call. At least I hope so. Otherwise, I don't know who is behind the panelist box on the screen. And I would invite you, Ambassador Witt, if you do want to respond at any point, you are most welcome to do so. But do you want to take the floor now?
Yeah, sure. Thank you very much. As you can see, I'm in the car at the moment. But thanks to all panelists for the presentations, but also for your responses to the very, very important questions. I really appreciate all this advice. But if I may, on this very last point that Ambassador Zlauvinen just mentioned, I tend to concur with him that as president of the conference, we cannot go into the conference with Plan A, B, or C. And as I indicated in one of the consultations I had with one of the regional groups, I urge states parties to come to the conference with plans A, B, C, and D to be ready to compromise, to be ready to be flexible in the negotiations, rather than them expecting the president to be in such position. I think that would be more useful than for the president to kind of guide the discussions and the negotiation process. If I may also touch upon one of the questions about the third pillar, from the consultations that I have had so far with states parties, this is a very, very important pillar for developing countries, and emerged in particular from the consultations I had just now in Addis Ababa with African states parties, will be one of the major priorities for these countries, because they believe that they need to benefit more from this particular pillar of the NPT. And as Chris pointed out, it is an Article 4 in the NPT that guarantees the inalienable rights of states parties to get access to the peaceful use of nuclear energy and technology. So it is an important pillar for, especially for developing countries. And I mean, there is much expectation that states parties can benefit from the science and applications of nuclear technology for their development needs. So again, just a re-emphasis on or reaffirmation of the need to focus on that pillar as well at the NPT Review Conference.
Thank you very much, Ambassador, and apologies because I really didn't mean to put you on the spot in transit, but I do nonetheless appreciate you joining the discussion and feeding in and responding. So greatly appreciated. I have a question now for Gauka. Then I want to come back to you, Chris, on some of Ambassador Viet's earlier questions, but perhaps I can turn to you, Gauka. And this is from the Q&A. It's from Basics Emerging Voices Network. It's perhaps a slightly tricky question or two questions, but I'll read it out and then give you the floor, Gauka. So between now and the 2026 Review Conference, what do you view as the key driver or development that could shape a positive outcome of the RevCon? What would be a key driver development that could shape the worst case scenario of the RevCon? And what do you view as some of the biggest threats to the RevCon? And with those three questions, good luck, Gauka, and the floor is yours. Thanks.
This would be the time to lose my connection. But thank you for the questions. I just wanted to pick up a little bit on the earlier discussion about the Plan A and Plan B, and how I agree that the president cannot go into the review conference already working on Plan B actively. But that is the issue, I think, with the structure of the review conference itself, where you had these very highly regulated proceedings of the general debate, committee, etc. And so that in the end leaves the president and the delegates with very little room for maneuver if they recognize that the comprehensive document is out of reach. And so a big challenge, I think, for anyone presiding over the review conference is to sense in that moment when it's the time to pivot and to have the material to work with. Because again, the president cannot just produce something, well, except in 1975, apparently, the president cannot just put something out of the blue on the table. The president has to work with what states parties bring to the table. And in 1995, it was the case that South Africa, Canada, a couple other countries brought something to the table that Ambassador Dhanapala was able to recognize that he can put these things together to have a package. Without that kind of active preparation and input from states parties themselves, I don't think a package of decisions would have been possible. And I would agree with Ambassador Viet's assignments to states parties to have their own kind of plans and ideas and proposals ready, so that during the review conference there is material to work on to if the need arises to pivot to negotiating something other than a standard comprehensive document. Now to the easy question. What are the key drivers for positive outcome? I would have to start with the baseline, and that is the reaffirmation of the treaty and past commitments. And that's something that's been coming up now and again during different review cycles. I think the outcome of the wretched 2005 review conference was the crystallization that there'll be always pushback against disavowal of past commitments, the body of those actions that some refer to as NPT acquis. And I think there is once again renewed anxiety among states parties, non-nuclear weapon states, that we are facing another cycle of disavowing past commitments, questioning their validity and usefulness, etc. So I think the baseline would be to not have that, to have a clear reaffirmation of the goals and past commitments. What could contribute to creating the positive atmosphere and the goodwill? I think some kind of resumption of arms control, extension of New START limits, and ideally kind of the resumption of actual dialogue between key nuclear weapon states on limitations, preserving current limitations and negotiating future limitations. I think that would be a big factor. And Chris already extensively covered the issue of transparency, accountability, and reporting. I think a breakthrough on that, a compromise on that with something practical and useful would very much contribute to a more positive atmosphere and potentially outcome at the review conference. Unfortunately, on the negative aspects and worst case scenarios, the field is very large. You can almost make your pick. We heard, unfortunately, way too much about possible resumption of nuclear testing in whatever form that might take. So if there is any further action on that, that would be extremely negative. And I talked about the CTBT before and how central it was to some of the outcomes of the past conferences. And so any kind of resumption of nuclear weapons testing would really strike at the heart of past achievements of the NPT review process and the regime writ large. But more in terms of the dynamics of the reviews process and review conference, I'm very worried about the current and developing intra-nuclear weapon state interactions. I'm not necessarily a fan of them all being together and defending their belief in nuclear weapons and nuclear deterrence, but I think the dynamics that we've had recently, where some of the key parties don't talk to each other, they don't negotiate directly or establish kind of new front lines, that I think it would be extremely detrimental to the running of the review of conference and the possibility of an outcome where we have had the Russia-West divide, we have had the breakdown of what used to be a consensus between US and Soviet Union, US and Russia on the kind of the primacy and priority of nuclear non-proliferation. We don't necessarily have that anymore. And we have the emergence of a new front line between US and China or Western bloc writ large and China. And so that certainly is not helping the chances of arriving at a consensus outcome.
Many thanks, Gaukar. I almost wished I'd asked you to provide the bad news first and end on the good news, but that's not the way it is. Ambassador Zlauvinen, I see you're unmuted. I was going to come back to you because I have a question I wanted to put to Chris, if that's okay. In fact, a couple of questions, Chris. So obviously, you're welcome to address any earlier points, but I wanted to remind you of the President-designate's earlier questions, specifically about how do we present and transmit institutional memory and how do we carry forward knowledge across review cycles. And then there is a specific question which is directed at you in the Q&A section. So I'm going to lob what is quite a tricky question your way, and I'll read it out here. Our panelists have talked about working practices at the RevCon and focus more on about how they focus more on actual negotiations rather than making statements. Chris, in practical terms, what would the main committee need to do to avoid MC1 being essentially an excruciating replay of the general debate? And I should emphasize that's a question, not necessarily a statement from me. And over to you, Chris. Chris, you're muted. Yep.
Just to add to what Gustavo said, I think Gustavo, Ambassador Zlauvinen, was the context of that review conference was really, really tricky because of the external geostrategic context with which he was faced. And I do think that that was a particular scenario that I think was unavoidable when it comes to the whole Plan A and Plan B thing, because I do think that I agree with him 100%, like right up until really the last couple of days, there were even no mutterings about breaking consensus, and certainly not from the state that ended up actually breaking consensus. So I think that just from a mechanics and a staging and a sequencing perspective was a really tough one. Having said that, I think some of the lessons that I learned, and I'll get to this in the answer to that question about panelists and working practices as well. There are some lessons to be taken away, I think, from 2022, which also can be taken away from 2015 and 2010 to a certain extent as well, even though 2010 worked. On the issue of institutional memory and carrying knowledge forward, I mean, this is just part and parcel of multilateral diplomacy. New diplomats are always going to come to these issues. They're always going to assume that nothing has been done before. And they're always going to try and reinvent the wheel. I think that's just how it happens. I mean, I've done it myself. I've been there. I think that's why panels such as this are really, really important as well. I do think it's really worthwhile, and I think kind of that the President Designate's taken a very good approach to this as well, and what he said at the start of looking back at history and seeing how this treaty has conducted itself. And I think certainly the point that we try to make is that this treaty has been remarkably successful because it is very unique in its ability to evolve. It evolved from a Cold War instrument to a post-Cold War instrument, and it's evolving again now. But the basic core tenets remain the same, and that's why it's able to evolve. In terms of that institutional memory, I think it behooves states to make stronger investments in their teams that actually deal with these issues. But it also behooves us as a secretariat to really be the repository of that institutional knowledge as well, and to be a tool for states parties to use. And I don't know if we are as good as that as we should be. So I would be certainly willing to take suggestions from states parties and other stakeholders as to how we can be a better repository of institutional knowledge and a better tool for states parties to use in that regard. But states parties have got to want to use it. I think in terms of the working methods, we had a situation, and again, this was just sheer dint of circumstances in 2022, where the main committees were meeting and doing their reports, and the outcome document was also being negotiated in the Finnish embassy. And I think that's kind of like, to my mind, that's a problem, because it means that the main committees are not doing what they're meant to be doing. That is an admission from the get-go that the review process is broken, and that the main committees are not doing what they're supposed to be doing. I think to that question, if you want to avoid the main committees being a repeat of the general debate, and main committee 1, thankfully, will not have to deal with Iran and DPRK and some of those other really tricky kind of issues that are under main committee 2. But anyway, I think the best way to avoid it being a repeat of the general debate is to negotiate text, but to get down to the negotiating of text from the get-go. I have consistently heard from states parties over the last 6 months in particular that states do better when they have text in front of them and when they're able to negotiate that text. So this is just my view. This is not, certainly I do not speak for the President Designate in any way, shape or form. But if you give the main committee something to negotiate early, they will do a much better job of not relitigating the general debate. And actually, I think it helps with transparency, it helps with inclusivity, and hopefully it helps with getting an outcome as well. I think that there are other ways that you can do it. Like, for example, main committees have a very rigid structure in that they are a formal speaking list, whereas the subsidiary bodies, because they're closed, are more interactive. I think we can wiggle our way through the rules of procedure to find a way to make the main committees more interactive without closing them. I think that's something, and states parties might actually have to take a procedural decision, but I suspect this is one that they might all be supportive of.
Many thanks, Chris. That's really interesting. I want to turn to Ambassador Zlauvinen, to follow up on any of the points. We also have another question which was added, and I'll read it out for you. But how do you expect the post-New START environment to impact on the prospect of the BrevCon? Is the shortened version. I'm also conscious we have about 5 minutes to go. So if I could perhaps invite you to combine that with some closing remarks, and perhaps if we begin with you, Ambassador, and then turn to Gaukar, and then back to you, Chris. If that's agreeable to everybody, Ambassador, the floor is yours, sir.
Thank you. Very briefly, following up on what Chris said, that I think just is up to the President designate, but also to the chairs of the main committees to change the dynamics. And I agree with him, we may have to change the procedures, but either the chairs of the main committees working together with the President go to the second week already with a text to be negotiated, or the chairs of the main committees during the second week, listening to specific positions and not to allow delegation to restate what they have already said in the plenary the first week, and push them to take the floor only to present a proposal for language. So if the second week is used for that, either chairs presenting text or delegation presenting text, and then third week is solely to negotiate those texts, I think we may have a better chance. On the questions, I'm not expecting so much impact of the post-start, just a situation, either because it's an extension. If it's an extension, it will be positive, but it's not going to be enough for the non-nuclear weapon states on their, as I say, on their frustration of lack of progress on nuclear disarmament. It will be a welcome, but it's not going to be enough. And if it's not renewed or extended, it will be an indicator or reassurances of their frustration, say that nothing's going on the disarmament front. So I'm not seeing that as a huge impact. Remember what happened in 2022? It was just extended. Everybody, many thought that it was going to be the solution, and it was not the solution. And concluding remarks, just to say what Chris mentioned and Gaukar, these type of panels are extremely useful. I believe that they have been useful to me when I was the president-designate, but have been useful for delegations to start warming up and be better prepared when we have to go to the review conference. It's not only for the delegations in New York, Vienna, and Geneva, but in particular those based in capital, because at the end of the day, interactions can be coming from capitals. Normally, my experience is that capitals only start paying attention to the review conference 2 months before the review conference to prepare for the interactions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador, both for the encouragement and the insights. Gaukar, short of time, but I'd like to give you the floor to any sort of concluding reflections or thoughts or answers to the question on the post-New START environment, and the screen is yours.
Well, thank you, Jamie. I think I mentioned the kind of the New START role potentially in or resumption and continuation of arms control, potential impact on the RevCon. And of course, if there is nothing, then we very certainly and decisively have nothing to report in terms of Article 6 implementation for the past period, and that is that's not a good situation, and that raises again the question of how are we actually going to honestly reflect that in the review document, and once again the question of how do you adopt a review document that's highly critical of the performance of central states in the regime. I wanted to touch a little bit on the organization of work and negotiation and also the role of the civil society. We had a workshop with some of the state parties in New York last month, starting to talk about the review conference, and this question came up about how to make this more interactive and productive. And many countries mentioned that it works much better for them if they have a piece of paper, some kind of text in front of them to work with. And so I would support the idea that was expressed earlier to have some kind of proposed text early on in the work of the main committee, so that the work of the main committee is already structured around reactions to some kind of a draft text based on maybe past working papers, past statements from the PrepComs, and then them coming in with concrete proposals on language for that kind of document, and that would, I think, facilitate interactivity rather than reading of committee-specific statements following the general debate. And then on the institutional memory, in the absence of strengthening the Secretariat for now for the more institutional memory role, just to remind you that civil society is there, and there's quite a bit of institutional memory in different non-governmental organizations, think tanks that have been following this issue, and so we, as always, kind of stand ready to support state parties in this regard, including through organizing kind of workshops and bringing together current delegates, past review conference officers, and the kind of participation and support of state parties in this regard is very important, I think. You're muted, Jamie.
Many thanks, Gaukar, for your time and wisdom, and I wish you a speedy recovery back to full health. Thank you for joining us. And nearly the last word to you, Chris. Over to you.
Thanks, Jamie. And just to endorse what the other panelists have said about the importance of events such as this, I think that heading into this review conference, we are very much at an inflection point for the NPT and ensuring that it remains fit for purpose for a new iteration and a new geostrategic environment, and to achieve its core role of preventing the spread of nuclear weapons, facilitating the spread of peaceful uses, but also bringing about a world free of nuclear weapons. And finding a balance on that is going to be really important. Heading into it, I think we're all also aware that we need to approach the review conference with the ambition that the treaty deserves, but also be very, very well aware of the constraints that we are under coming into the conference, and how we reconcile that ambition with those constraints, I think, is going to be key for states parties. I do think that one of the things that has come out of this workshop today, this panel today, is that process can help. If you have a process that works, if you have a process that makes states parties really feel like they are included in the maintenance of the treaty and in the implementation of the treaty, so you can include transparency, inclusivity, negotiation, then I think that will go part of the way to reminding states parties about why this treaty is so important, because it does continue to provide really, really concrete security benefits on a daily basis. And that, I think, needs to be the one thing that states parties carry into the review conference, and then look to see how we can, as I say, get through 4 weeks and come out at the other end with a result that, even if everyone's not happy with, at least ensures that the NPT remains the cornerstone of the regime.
Great. Many thanks, Chris. I think that's a great way to conclude. We are slightly over, but with your indulgence, I would like to take this opportunity to thank all of our panelists and speakers. Thank you, Chris, Gaukar, Ambassador Zlauvinen, and Ambassador Viet for joining this discussion. Thanks to those of you in the audience for your participation in the discussion and the active questions that you put to our panelists. Is very much appreciated. I'd also like to take this opportunity to thank my colleagues that are hidden behind the black panels on your screen, to Louisa, to Nick, to Maria, for helping to make things work, and to our UNODA colleagues for their input and collaboration on this event. I should note this event and indeed the series are being funded through support from the government of Switzerland. So thank you to Switzerland for the opportunity to be able to do this. And I should note the next event in this series, and it follows on from the last question that we had, is on nuclear arms control at the crossroads, implications for the NPT. And this will take place on the 10th of December between 4 o'clock and 5:30. I think that's Central European time, so Geneva time. And for that event, we're hoping to have a participation of Rose Gottmuller, Tom Klopov, and Tong Xiao, with some additional opening remarks from Jarmo Väinänen. So I think another interesting discussion to have on this topic in December. Do keep an eye on social media for the registration link for that event. Also, before we do close, if I could encourage you to complete an online feedback form, it doesn't take very long. It's anonymous, and you can find the link in the chat and also on your screen. It is helpful for us, and we welcome comments, criticism, preferably constructive, but we'll take whatever comes, and also suggestions and ideas for future events. So we'd welcome them. And with that, it just remains for me to say a good afternoon, a good day, or a good night, depending on when this finds you. And thank you all very much.